triangle.
Right.
Rain today. Good.
All right, good morning and welcome to Adult Forum. Glad to have Andy Rook here with us today. I met Andy, I'm guessing about 10 years ago, 10 or 12 years ago. He lives where I live in Holly Springs, and we've ran together, worked out together at a local fitness group. And anytime we're together, there's great discussion and book reviews and et cetera. So I'm glad to have you join in with your sons as well. Also a Duke super fan, athletics, and I would argue probably a Duke Divinity super fan as well, even though so. But Andy Rook comes to us today by way of Holly Springs. He was born and raised in Greenville, North Carolina. From an early age, his family had him involved in local church life. After graduating high school, he made his way to Georgia and obtained his undergraduate degree in biblical studies with a minor in youth ministry from Emmanuel University. Years later, he made his way to New Jersey and received his Master's of Divinity degree from Princeton Theological Seminary, where he concentrated in Old Testament and Hebrew studies. Professionally, Andy has served in many roles, both within business and ministry spaces, often with a customer service and leadership focus. He served in faith communities as children's and then family pastor, elder, and currently volunteers as an adult teacher, as well as young adult and youth ministry leader. In his day job, he's a manager of systems and data and analytics at First Citizens Bank. A joy of his life is following his two teenage sons to all their sporting events, and thank you both for joining us today. When he's not doing that, you'll probably find him involved in one of his other loves, all things Duke sports or avidly reading. So, the Bible, theology, science, history, and how all these intersect are his favorite topics. And couldn't have a better one to start with the first chapter of the Bible. So Andy, glad to have you here. And welcome.
Appreciate it. And definitely thank you, Doug, for the introduction and for the opportunity to be here. It is definitely a dream for me to be here. Like he was saying, I grew up with this university and this place in Durham, kind of in the background of my life. I think I was 10, and my sister made us go to a dumb UNC game. And we had to go over there and watch a game. And then my parents, because we came all this way from Greenville, agreed to come over here and at least try to find Cameron. And so we drove around the campus, and that was the first time I remember being here. And we've been here a bazillion times since. I think whether it's sports or concert or any type of thing, we would a little louder.
Yeah,
okay, there you go. Sure. All right. So we would be here. And so definitely it's a privilege to be here. And for me, it's a lot of my worlds intersecting together between God, faith, community, and just definitely a privilege to be here today. And what I'm going to present is one of my favorite areas of study, which is the Old Testament, Genesis, and trying to look at Genesis through the eyes of an ancient person, an ancient Israelite, or an ancient, just an ancient person at that time that maybe was from a different community. So framing the session, we're going to look a little bit at the challenges that ancient texts present to us, talk about entering the culture of a text, and then looking at Genesis as ancient cosmology. We'll talk about that. And then at the end, I want to present kind of a way that you could look at the world outside of just Genesis, but through the whole of Scripture and what we've seen and learned, how we could view the world and a model for how to approach those things. So the challenges of ancient texts. What challenges has anyone experienced? Has anyone loved the Old Testament or love ancient Near East things? What kind of challenges have you been in your own maybe studies or experience with the Old Testament? Yell it out.
I think everybody has trouble with the 6-day thing.
Yeah.
But actually, after spending so much time listening to people here, I reconciled it. It's
Yeah.
no problem.
Right. So specific question about 6 days and all that kind of thing. So different pieces of the story that kind of are challenging to deal with. So that's great. Yeah. So there's two major challenges that kind of work on exactly what you're saying. And this, some of what I've prepared for today comes from this book, which is The Lost World of Genesis 1. John Walton is a theologian that does a great job of kind of exploring these kinds of questions and topics. And he says the Old Testament does communicate to us, and it is written for us and for all humankind, but it was not written to us. And I think that's kind of the challenge sometimes, is that we have this writing that is for us, but it wasn't written to us. And so it was written to a different people at a different time, at a different place. And it can be a challenge sometimes to figure out exactly how they thought and how we kind of interlace that together and figure out where we go with it from here. The challenges of approaching ancient texts. So two main challenges. One is the language, right? And the other is culture. So for Old Testament texts, primarily, they're written in the language of Hebrew, right? Which is a very ancient language, doesn't look anything like English. It actually reads backwards from the other direction, right? If you open up a Hebrew Bible, you open it up this way, right? Like there's so much about it that is foreign that it kind of slaps you in the face immediately when you look at it. And because of that, there's challenges that exist in translating terms and concepts from from Hebrew into English, right? And so one example that I just put here is there's a passage in Genesis that talks about how Sarah was beautiful, right? And so that one's not so hard. Like we can get a good word, we can identify the Hebrew word, and we can say, okay, this looks like beauty, but what did beautiful mean at that time, right? Like, is their concept of beauty the same as our concept of beauty? We can put the word there, but we still have to do the work of figuring out, like, well, what did beautiful mean at that time to that people in that space? We can't just kind of lift it out and put our concepts in there. Another example is the Hebrew word kesed. And this one is probably one of the most challenging words that are translated in the Old Testament, because it just doesn't have a good word in English that we can kind of put on it. So instead, we've just thrown a lot of stuff at it, kind of like throwing the kitchen sink at it, right? So we've done loving kindness, like mixed two words together, faithfulness, steadfast love. Like we're trying to figure out exactly what this word means, but it's a challenge. And so we kind of have to like throw a lot of our words at it, because there just isn't an English word that that covers the fullness of what that word actually means. So that's the language piece that's always a challenge. And then there's also the challenge of a culture, right? So the language of any ancient text, including the Bible, it assumes a culture. It operates in a culture, right? It serves a culture, and it communicates into a culture, right? So you have language, and then you have this culture. And not only do you have the language to translate, but you got to figure out what to do with the culture as well. And that can be a big challenge. And one of the temptations, I think, whenever we come into looking at ancient texts, is to try to translate their culture to our culture. Instead of first, we've got to like look at their culture on its own and figure out what it meant to them. And so that's what we're going to look at today, is kind of what would an ancient person have thought when they came into contact with Genesis 1.
Can everyone hear okay, or do I still need to turn up the mic a little bit?
Good. All right, a little bit.
I'm gonna make this full screen.
Oh, yeah.
Which is great.
Thanks for everybody being online as well. And thanks for being here in person on the day that the time changed. So, challenge, right?
Literally up with the birds this morning.
Yeah, right. It was dark when I got up this morning, and that's not been the case lately. All right, let's see. Is that better? Can you hear? Oh, a little bit of feedback. All right. How about now?
Yeah.
That sounds better. I hear that a little bit, maybe.
Where could the feedback coming from? Do we have it also?
Uh,
Do we need this audio on, or do I need?
when it gets above a certain level.
The ceiling mic's on?
I put those on mute.
Okay.
Is there any other thing that's picking us
Like
up?
there's a mic live somewhere.
Yeah, I'll turn it down a little then.
All right. We'll try that. And
everyone online can hear, okay?
I got a thumbs up. Okay, I got a thumbs up online.
Okay.
Yep, 3 thumbs up. All right, awesome. And if it gets to be feedback or, if it's not loud enough, somebody just give me a thumb in the back of the room and I'll try to talk a little louder. Okay, so reading the Bible, including Genesis 1, is a cross-cultural experience. And that's not something we think about when we think about reading often, right? Like if we go to another country and we visit them, that makes sense as a cross-cultural experience. But actually going to an ancient text is also a cross-cultural exercise, right? We have to step into a different culture, a different worldview that they have in order to understand what the authors are trying to communicate. And it is only when we step outside of all the controversial debates that we have in our contemporary culture and try to read Genesis 1 in its ancient context that we can make headway in true understanding of what the chapter's meaning is. And so this is what I put as the key. We can't try to translate an ancient culture to ours, lifting it from its context, its culture, and relocating it to our own. Instead, we must try to enter into the culture, right? So you have to enter the culture on its own terms. And I think it's fascinating that we get an example of how to do this from God Himself, right? Like, as we go through the Bible, we see that God's continuously entering into to humanity, to our space, to communicate to us and show us a way that we can connect to Him. And so it's entering into that culture that even He shows us an example of how to do that. So we're going to look at what the culture of an ancient person would have been at this time. So entering the culture of a text, there's 3 things that I kind of pulled out that I want to discuss: natural versus supernatural, material creation versus a functional creation, and it's an ancient cosmological text, which is kind of make me think of like the top of Jeopardy, right? Like these are the categories on the board, right? But we'll look at each of these. So natural versus supernatural. I think if you were trying to think like an ancient person, like for us, this is kind of a key question for us. Like we're always asking, like, is it supernatural? Is it natural? Right? But an ancient person, like that wasn't a question for them. It wasn't about whether something was natural or supernatural. That's kind of a modern debate that we have. Everything was supernatural. Like deity was just pervasive in the ancient world. Everybody thought if something happened, a deity was involved. Like that was just the natural mindset that they would have had. That was the view that they would have had. So they weren't trying to figure out if God created the universe. Like that was just a given. It was a given that God created the universe. Their question was not if, but which God created the universe. And if you could figure that out, what was that God like? Right. And so that's the key question. So like for us, again, we kind of get caught in the debate of natural versus supernatural. But if you're going to look at this text through an ancient person's eyes, you have to kind of put that to the side because that wasn't a question that they really had. They would have just assumed that everything that happened in the world was supernatural. There was a God involved, and they were trying to figure out who it was and what that meant. So material creation versus functional creation. This is interesting. I think one of the hardest kind of concepts for us to get from our viewpoint in the West and here is that, what does it mean for each of these things to exist, right? So I have a chair, I've got Duke University, and I got a picture of a restaurant, right? So like, this is just the idea that there are different ways of viewing the creation of something. So like, we, especially here in the West and in our modern culture, we tend to think very materialistically. Like we want to know, like, what is a chair made from? What kind of wood is it? Where did it come from in the world? We'll do an analysis of it. We'll have a microscope. We can look at the atoms. We can look at all these different things, right? So when we talk about something existing or something being creative in our culture, we tend to get very material oriented and we want to say, oh, we know it exists because X, Y, and Z, and these are the things that I can see and I can prove, and like science is a big part of all of that. I mean, these other examples are just showing like there are other ways to view creation, right? So like when would you say a university exists, right? Like is it when the buildings got here? Or is it when the curriculum was created that is going to be taught at a university? Or is it when the students show up or when the professors are hired, right? So like that kind of creation, that kind of existence has much more to do with like all of these functions being set up. And once all of those things are functioning, the university exists, right? And so there is a way of viewing that. Another similar example kind of is the idea of a restaurant, right? Like you can build the building, you can hire the staff. If you don't have a certificate of occupancy, the restaurant probably doesn't exist, right? So like there's certain things that have to be ordered and set in motion and in place. And once they're there, this entity exists, right? And so this is just an example to show that like an ancient person's through their eyes, they would have been much more likely to view the world in these second two instances than in the first. Like materially, it wasn't that they didn't care. It was just everything they knew existed because God made it, right? So they weren't questioning like all the material questions of how it happened and this kind of thing. It was more about how does it work? What's its function? And how does that work in our world?
Got a question.
Sure.
Just a minute ago, you were talking about the viewpoint of people in the ancient world being polytheistic. But Genesis is not polytheistic, so
Right.
can you maybe?
Yeah, we're gonna talk about that. It's a great question, and we're gonna hit that actually in just a second, and then a little bit more. So, but yeah, they are, in the ancient world, most of the rest of the world was polytheistic, right? They had many gods, and we're gonna look at that. And then this ancient world or this ancient text is different from that. So we're going to look exactly at some of the things and how they're different from what the rest of the world would have seen. And that's the point, right? Like an ancient Israelite would have been in communication with all these other cultures in some way, and they would have heard other stories, other ideas, other ways of ordering the universe, and they would have had questions about it, and then they would have come to theirs and seen differences for sure, right? And so we'll get into some of those in just a second. Um, this one is just, I'll go through this fast. We're not going to look at all these. I just have all these up there. These are all, like you're saying, other ancient cultures that had kind of a pantheon of different gods, right? And the point from this is not to know all of them or anything, but if you think about them, the gods that they had were very much functionally oriented, right? So, like if you think about, some of you may know these from your studies in school or high school or whatever. I had Latin, so we had to learn a lot of these. But like Mars is the god of, does anybody know? War, right? Venus is the goddess of
Love.
right? Yeah, beauty, love, right? So it wasn't that they created these things, it's that they were like functionally over some area, right? So, and the thing to take away is the ancient mindset. That's how people thought. It wasn't so much that, oh, this God created this thing and how they created it. It was that there was this entity that was an order over something. So they were over love, they were over war, like they functioned in that role in that kind of universe that they had. And so it's just another clue that lets us know that like maybe ancient people would have looked at this more from a functional perspective than a material perspective. And again, I'll add this to it. That doesn't mean that Genesis isn't materially created by God. Like that's not what I'm saying. They would have just by default believed that God created everything material and functional, right? But what we see in Genesis 1 gives us a viewpoint of a functional creation more so than a materialistic one. So the other piece is it's an ancient cosmological text, right? So cosmology is a big word, but it just means the study of how civilizations understand the origin, the structure, the operation of the universe. And so all these ancient communities had their own kind of view of how the universe was ordered, how it was created, what that cosmology looked like. And Genesis is an ancient cosmology for the Israelite people. It's interesting to note that it's ancient, right? That's the first word. It's an ancient cosmology. It's not a modern cosmology. It doesn't try to address cosmology in modern terms or modern questions. And sometimes we get into the trouble or mental gymnastics when we're trying to make Genesis, which is an ancient cosmology, fit into our modern box, right? So So it's very much, point three here that God didn't find it important to revise their thinking. It's interesting. There's not an instance in the Bible where God like gave someone some new science that was beyond what they thought. Like God, and this is the beautiful thing about God, He comes to us where we are, as we are, and He talks to us in terms that we can understand, right? Where we're at that point. So He didn't just download and say, "Oh, well, your cosmology is wrong, or your way you're looking at the universe. Let me show you how the world really works." He met them where they were, and ancient models were often function oriented, meaning that things were seen to exist only once they were assigned a role and a purpose within an ordered system. Um, Okay, so we're gonna get into like again, like you were saying, there was different views in the ancient world of how they would look at the structure of the universe, and there were some similarities that kind of show up in various ones, and we'll look at some of those. But there's usually a tripartite structure, right? So there's usually this three-part structure when you're looking at an ancient view of the universe. There was the heavens, which is the realm above, often believed to be held back by a solid barrier called the firmament, rakia in Hebrew. And this barrier separated the earthly world from the celestial waters, right? So you had the earth, which is generally perceived as a flat disk or continent, often floating upon some type of primordial ocean, right? And then you had the underworld, which is this underneath the earth realm, underneath the land, like Sheol, where the dead resided. So if you think about an ancient person, right, like a lot of this makes sense. If you walked far enough in the ancient world, you would eventually run into what? Yeah, cliff. Yeah, and off the cliff there might be some water, right? So like you probably run into some water if you walk long enough. If you dug down in the ground deep enough, you'd find water, right? And then occasionally it looked like the skies would open up windows and water would just fall out of the sky too. So an ancient person had this view, regardless of which kind of culture they were in, they often had this view of like three things. There was like these heavens, which were above, and there seemed to be some water up there. There's water somewhere underneath it, and there's the earth and the land. And so you had this place where the heavens, which is like the skies, and ancient people had no access to that, right? Magnificent, but not something that they could access. So it was seen as a place where the gods dwelt somewhere out there, right? The land was our place, was humans' place. That's where the humans were. And then there's this underworld idea of underneath. Um, also, there was also the geocentrism, excuse me. The Earth was almost universally placed at the center in the ancient world, right? So it took us a long time to figure out that we were revolving around the sun and not the sun revolving around us, right? So, and it's interesting, like God didn't see the need to like, again, download some, no, that's not right. Like the ancient people looked at it that way because that's kind of how they saw the world. And God met them there and shows them how to connect to Him through those things. Divine governance, again, natural phenomena were personified as gods, spiritual forces. For instance, in many ancient cultures, the sun and the moon were often seen as deities that were traveling across the sky, right? So you hear that. There's the sun and the moon as a god or goddess that's going through the sky. And then order versus chaos was a big thing, which creation was frequently described as a process of bringing order into a chaotic, watery, primordial state rather than creating matter from nothing, right? So there's this idea of like there's some type of chaos, some type of thing that isn't controllable, that is out there. And it's not terribly surprising that water would be associated with that, right? Because that ancient person, if you ran into water, if you fell in the water, you probably weren't going to last very long, right? Like people weren't really swimming, boating a whole lot yet, so like the water was not seen as a safe space, right? The skies were inaccessible, not even a thought or an imagination of being able to do anything in the sky. And then the water was this place of like scariness, probably of like, if I get in the water, I better get out really quick because I don't know how to survive in that locale. So it's not surprising that ancient cosmologies would kind of use water and see water in this way. So these are just some examples of ancient cosmologies, and some of them you kind of can see they're just representative. Some of them are near the time, some of them are not, but most of them have this idea of there being some kind of thing above the sky, and then there being a land portion, and then there being something underneath holding it all up. And we'll look at the ancient Israelite piece here, and I've got what I'll call my best representation of getting a ancient cosmology in a box from Amazon, right? So like if I had to pick something to represent this idea, this is the closest thing I got, right? So unfortunately, I don't have a cake in it. I'll bring it up here, but again, an ancient person would have seen the world as there was something underneath supporting it. So like that's where you see these verses and you hear ancient things talking about the pillars of the earth, right? Like there's this structure underneath the land, because they don't view the earth as a ball or a sphere, right? Like it's a flat piece of land that there's verses that talk about it tottering off its or teetering off its foundations, right? So like there's this idea that there's something underneath it. There was a belief that possibly the mountains were somehow supporting the sky in some way, right? Like was it sitting on there? And then there was this belief that there was some kind of dome, some kind of thing that was out there that was kind of over it, that held back waters, and that God would open up and bless with rain when the time was come. And again, it's just an ancient kind of way of viewing the world, but it shows up a bit and makes some of Genesis, you can see where they're coming from, or what they're talking about when they talk about certain things that are very hard. And again, we can get into trouble when we try to like make all of science have all these features, right? Because it was an ancient way of viewing the world where it was flat. Everything was, the stars were put in this dome, right? And the sun was up there and it moved around. It wasn't lined up with what we later learned when we got a telescope and we had people in science and seeing that we revolved around the sun, right? And so again, the ancient Hebrew conception of the universe had this idea of God in the heavens of heavens. You see this in some of the Old Testament scriptures, that there's this highest of highs, the sky of skies, the heavens of heavens, and God is out there. And then there's these waters above the firmament, or this shield almost. And then underneath that is the sky, and then there's the earth, right? And then underneath that is the foundations of the earth and Sheol. And so when an ancient person would have encountered this text of Genesis, it starts with, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, right? Like that's how we translate it most of the time. Well, what an ancient person would have seen was, in the beginning, God created the skies and the land. Like that's how they would have seen it. We kind of bring in our idea often of like heaven, and it's not necessarily wrong, but the text is telling skies and land, right? That's what God has created: the skies and the land, all the places that we can see and know and exist in. It starts there, and so that's where that would have started. So not only did the ancients have various cosmologies, but there were also many creation myths. And Genesis could be viewed as responding to some of these. So this kind of gets to your point of like, hey, how did other communities view the universe and how it began and where it came from? So some contemporary cultures and their ideas. So in Mesopotamia, there was the Enuma Elish, which is kind of their core creation story. The idea is the universe was born from violence. So at the beginning, the gods fight. There's Marduk, and he kills this chaos dragon named Tiamat. And creation is made from a corpse. And then humans are created to serve the gods as slaves. So creation equals the aftermath of divine warfare in that model, right? So that was a contemporary way to view the universe that was out there that an ancient Israelite would have ran into. Another one was Egypt. So their creation myth, their core idea was creation emerged from the primeval waters, right? So it's chaos. Again, this idea of chaos. The sun god Ra, or Atum, rises out of the chaos, and the pharaohs end up being divine extensions of the gods. And creation is unstable and must be sustained by ritual. So in that kind of mythology, creation equals a fragile order holding back the chaos. And then the other one that was kind of contemporary at the time would have been the Canaanite version. And that was Baal versus Yam. So the storm god is Baal, and he battles the sea. So again, there's this idea of like a fight between gods that start everything. Kingship is earned through violence, and fertility depends on seasonal divine conflict. So in this model, nature equals a reflection of a divine power struggle. So these are just three kind of things that, like, when an ancient Israelite would have first encountered Genesis 1, they most likely would have had some of these concepts in their background, or at least heard these ways of viewing the universe before, right? And so it's something to think about, like, okay, this is what they would have seen now. How would they have viewed the world differently, right? Like, what would their account, how would it counteract these things? And you can see that in many ways. So there's ways you can look at it as a direct kind of counter narrative to some of these accounts, right? So one, there's no divine combat. Like, an ancient Israelite would have gone into this and said, all the other accounts start with a fight. There's gods fighting each other to see who's the most powerful or who's going to do this or do that, right? So there's this battle. In an Israelite account, there was no combat. Creation happens after the gods fight, and other myths. Order is carved out of chaos through violence, right? In Genesis 1, there's no battle. There's no rival gods, right? There's just one. Again, to your point, there's just one here, right? And God simply speaks, right? There isn't a fight. God just speaks stuff into existence, right? Which would have been totally different. Everywhere else, the gods are having to fight. There has to be this conflict. God just says it, and it is so, right? So the mic drop moment is chaos isn't a rival force in the Genesis 1 account. It's just matter awaiting command, right? So, like, in the ancient world, chaos was something that had to be tamed. It was something that had to be fought. And in the Genesis account, they would have come to it and said, "Oh, I see a difference already," right? Like, chaos is just something that is spoken to and created into existence, right? So a different way to view it than they would have seen in the world around them. Counterpart and following that theme, chaos is not a god. So in other myths, chaos was a god. You have Tiamat, Yam, Noon. They're divine and they're dangerous and they must be slain. So, like, you have this, a lot of times it's represented as a dragon or a serpent or a leviathan or something like that. But in the other myths, chaos actually was part of the god structure. And in Genesis 1, the deep, which is Tiham, exists, but it's impersonal, right? So the deep is kind of the Israelite concept of chaos, and it's impersonal. It's not a god. It isn't something that has to be fought. God isn't threatened by it at all, right? There's no struggle. There's no fear. And it's interesting, the translation, though, in Hebrew, they believe that the word Tiham sounds like Tiamat. So, like, an ancient person would have been like, oh, that sounds like that other god from the Canaanites or wherever that I've heard about. And this is just showing that, like, that's not a god at all. Another piece or counter narrative that Genesis 1 gives us is the sun and the moon are not gods, right? So in other cultures, this was very common. The sun and the moon were usually a major deity in the pantheon of gods that they had. You had Ra, Shamash, Sin. But when you get to Genesis 1, they aren't even named, right? Like, you get to Genesis, I forget which verse, I think it's 5 or maybe 6. But they don't even name the sun and the moon, right? They're just called merely the greater light and the lesser light, right? And so it's almost like the author is giving some intentional shade, right? Of like, hey, Genesis demotes the most worshiped gods in the ancient world just to lamps, right? Like, this is the greater light and this is the lesser light. Whereas all the other ancient cultures had all this stuff around a god of the sun and a god of the moon and all the things that you had to do in a temple and all this stuff. And in Genesis, it's just like, this is the greater light and this is the lesser light, right? And it's just a light source. So that would have immediately jumped out at an ancient person, right? That this is different than everything else I've heard. Where's the sun god? Where's the moon god? Oh, there's only one god? Okay. So 4, humans are not slaves. So in the other myths and the other kind of views that were out there, humans were created to feed the gods, right? So you had to go to the temple and you had to bring the food or sacrifice or something. And you were basically a laborer so the god could rest, right? So that was kind of the whole kind of creation of that. And you had to do certain things. And then whatever that god's function was, you might be blessed with said function if you did the right things for that god and you served that god well. In Genesis 1, I mean, talk about counter-cultural, right? Like humans are created in God's image. So not just laborers, but they're rulers, not servants, but rulers, right? So in the Genesis account, the people are rulers and they're given dignity and purpose. Let them have dominion, right? So it was a revolutionary idea that every human bears divine image, not just kings, right? So in Egypt, the Pharaoh was considered like divine, right? And so an ancient Israelite would have said, okay, this is different, right? Like it's not just the king that's divine, it's not just the Pharaoh that's divine. Like this is telling me that every human bears a divine image, right? Completely different than what they would have seen in the world around them. Number 5, God needs no temple, right? So in the other myths, creation ends with the building of a temple so that God can rest, right? And rest equals taking residence to receive offerings, right? So like you build the God a temple, and then the God comes and rests in the temple and just sits back and relaxes, and you bring the food or you bring the stuff. In Genesis 1, God rests without a temple. Rest equals sovereignty, not fatigue. This is similar to like talking about a functional view. Like when God rests on the 7th day, it's not that he's done and he stops, right? And there's nothing else to do. No, rest means coming into and sitting in a position of sovereignty and then kind of ruling and starting to do the business of this domain that he set up, of the universe that he set up. Similar to kind of like if we're talking about the university model, right? Like you build it, you open it, the semester starts, and there's still work that is done and carried out, right? You're resting in it, but your rest is the authority and the sovereignty of you now making all of this stuff function and happen. So the universe itself and the entire cosmos is God's ordered space, and the universe itself is God's temple. And we'll talk about that a little bit more here as we close. Number 6, creation is declared as good. So in the other myths, matter was seen as dangerous, flawed, again, chaotic was a huge theme. The physical world is suspect, right? So in Genesis 1, the phrase is just repeated, hammered over and over again. And God saw that it was good. And God saw that it was good, right? The other accounts at this time that they would run into would have seen, again, chaos, dangerous, like something that had to be fought, right? And so physical creation is intentional and it's valuable. And this lays the groundwork for us later for ethics, for stewardship. And when we get to Christian theology, like incarnation, right? Like we can places because God's telling us the universe is good. He created it good. He saw that it was good. So a few key moments that we often miss with our modern eyes. So switching for a minute, we've looked at kind of how an ancient person would have run through the world and seen all these different views and then come to their own. But for us, when we get to Genesis 1, what are a few of the things that sometimes we can miss? So again, I touched on this briefly before, but the heaven and the earth in verse 1. Again, it's hard for us to see the word earth and not immediately go to that picture from the Apollo program where they're on the moon and now we see this sphere for the first time, right? And all of its glory. And so like when we see Earth, we think the Earth, a sphere, all the solar system, all the stuff that we've learned over the ages. They wouldn't have seen that. They would have thought the land, and the land was the place where the people were. And the heavens, like we said, were the skies. So for us, Earth, we go right to the ball in the sphere that we know of, and heavens, we tend to go to the afterlife and like where we go when we die. And so like it's hard for us with our modern eyes sometimes to separate that and go back to how an ancient person would have seen it, because they didn't really have that concept that we have with all the layers of the years of theology and the things that we're bringing to the text, right? The creation of light on day 1, similar to kind of like where you were saying, there's these kind of instances where things are are sometimes problematic. And so like we had the creation of light on day one, but the sun and the moon are like day three, I think it is, or something like it's out of order almost, right? And you're like, well, how do we have light without the sun, right? Like that doesn't make sense to our science world. But if you look at the text, he says he created light, and then he called it what? Does anybody remember what he says? They create light, and I called it day, and then the darkness. So he separates the light from the darkness. The light he calls day, and the darkness he calls night, right? Which that's weird because everybody else would have called it the sun and the moon, probably, right? Like in the other ancient cosmology. But here we're seeing that like it isn't so much that God's creating the sun and the moon, he's creating time, right? Like this is how an ancient person would have seen it, that the creation in that first verse where he separates light from darkness is he's setting up a function, a day. The light is a day. There's night. That's the time of darkness, right? And so like the functional view of that would have been that he's setting up the order of time first, and then a few days later he creates the sun and the moon, and you see all that piece of it, right? So sometimes with our modern eyes we can get caught in kind of like the gymnastics of trying to figure out the science and get trapped a bit. This one is probably one of my favorite, the significance of 7 days of creation. Does anybody have an idea of why 7 days? Like, why wasn't it 8 or 9 or 4? You know, what do you think the significance of 7 days is?
I got tired on 6.
Yeah, yeah. Could be, yeah, he was tired. That makes sense.
Doesn't the number 7 have some special significance?
Yeah. For sure. There's a couple. 7 definitely is seen as like the number of perfection, and kind of like an idea of God rested on the seventh day makes sense. But one of the things that when I was studying this that I had never really connected, and I think an ancient person would have immediately saw this, right? Like this is a great example of where we struggle to make a connection that an ancient person would have made in like a second, right? So the 7-day structure of the creation narrative is confusing and kind of controversial for us today sometimes, but ancient Israelites, like I said, would have never had they wouldn't have batted an eye at it, because they would have had another message that they heard loud and clear, which is that creation is God's temple, right? So like in the ancient culture, they knew when they saw a 7-day thing, it had to do with an inauguration of a temple, right? And we have examples of it in the Old Testament Bible as well, these verses here. But it was true not just for an Israelite temple, but for other temples as well. We have ancient records describing a 7-day ritual for a temple built by a Sumerian king more than 1,000 years before Solomon's reign, and before he erected the great temple in Jerusalem. And the ritual was so deeply ingrained in ancient culture that an Israelite would have immediately understood that a 7-day creation story was meant to show that creation itself was a temple for their God, right? And so in Leviticus, the Israelites held a 7-day ceremony to dedicate the sacred tabernacle in the wilderness. So the tabernacle in the wilderness had a 7-day ceremony to dedicate that when it was completed, right? In 1 Kings 8, and Solomon dedicates the temple in Jerusalem with 2 back-to-back 7-day ceremonies in the 7th month of the calendar, right? So 7, definitely something's going on with the sevens, right? But he had 2 7-day ceremonies to inaugurate this temple. And then Ezekiel, the prophet, envisions a new temple in Jerusalem and foresees a 7-day ritual celebration. So like an ancient mind would have connected immediately with the idea of, oh, there's 7 days, like that totally makes sense. The author's trying to tell me that like not only is this garden and this universe created in 7 days, but it's the temple for this God, right? Like the other places you had to build a temple and the God went and sat in the temple. In the Genesis account, the garden is the temple where God exists and where he is with his people, right? And we'll get into a little bit of the intricacies of that in a moment. But again, the last bit is the garden is viewed as a temple. If you get into like looking at the tabernacle or looking at Solomon's temple, if you read, like sometimes those verses can be very boring where it's saying, and this, artisan created this thing, and this guy made the bronze basins and all this kind of stuff. But if you look at those texts where it talks about the specifics of how they set up the tabernacle and how they set up the temple, you'll start to see that like they're making all these floral kind of arrangements and like designs and stuff out of bronze, but it has this garden feel to it. Like if you go back and you look at those things, um, the inside of the temple had a lot of things that would have reflected a garden. And so for sure, when they came about building the temple, it was reflected back to the garden because the garden was the original temple. It was a place where God dwelt, where God connected with his creation. Sure.
Got another question. So this probably goes beyond your topic, but I'm curious. How long has it been that we have this concept of 7 being a week and work days and weekends? I mean, does that go way, way back,
Yeah.
or is that relatively?
I think that's a good question. I don't know, like I'll speak not as an authority, but as just a thought. I think for sure, the days of the week and then end up being 7. I think some of that has its traditions in the Roman kind of view of the world and getting to the names of the days and all that kind of stuff. I think for sure our 7-day in Genesis has some impact on that of how we came to that piece. I'm not sure the history of when it happened and when it became 7 versus a different number.
The Old Testament professor I had said that when you see numbers, there's specific things that you think of. 40 days, 40 nights means a darn long time.
Yep.
7 generally, if my memory is correct, is a number meaning complete.
Yeah, definitely completion. I think it comes from creation being completed in 7 days, right? And then I think the thing that we sometimes don't connect is just this idea that a temple was inaugurated in 7 days. There was always a celebration. And so the idea that creation was done in 7 days and then God rested, it was telling the reader or the hearer that God had made a temple and his temple was here. Right, which is totally different than the other things they would have ran into. I know God's temple's over there, and I have to go there and I have to do certain things, right? Like God came to us, the temple's here, which gets me to what I'm going to close with in the last few minutes, which is just as we look at Genesis and you look at kind of the ancient way that they may have viewed it, how can we now look at the universe, our universe, in light of that, in light of the rest of the Bible that we've seen? And so I want to just kind of present a little bit of a way of how you could look at it. This is kind of, as a data person, I love Venn diagrams. So this is kind of like a Venn diagram, right? I have 2 here too that I use sometimes when I try to talk about this. But if we look at Genesis 1, it's in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, right? At the beginning in Genesis 1, the heavens and the earth, like God's domain and our domain, was one place, right? Wasn't split in 2. Where God was is where the people were. They was all one spot, right? And then we flip the page and some bad stuff happens and that gets broken, right? And so so you can see the story of the universe of how all of this stuff is that at the beginning it was like this, right? Those 2 domains overlap. God's domain and humans domain was one place. And then it got separated, it got split. And then there's this, if we get to Revelations, what happens? It comes back to one again, right? So like you can view the whole story of the Bible, the whole story of the universe as this story of God created a space to connect with us. It got split apart and he's been working to put it back together ever since, right? And so we kind of live, we're in this space, right? Like this is back then, this is the ultimate future. We're kind of in this middle space where there's some overlap, right? And so you can see all of Scripture, all of the rest of the Bible and history as God attempting to reconnect with the humans and make a space where he can connect with them, right? So again, at the beginning, heaven and earth, one place, right? And then it got split apart, right? And so heaven is seen as the kingdom of God, eternal life, right? The world is seen as this present age. It gets called that in the Bible, the age of sin and death, right? And so you have this idea of there's these 2 domains that used to be one place, and now they're separated and they can't quite get back together. In the God domain, right, there's his presence, there's goodness, there's justice, there's beauty. the other domain where the humans are, there's sin, there's injustice, there's ugliness, and it keeps like those things are bouncing against each other and they can't overlap. Until God says, let's figure out a way to make that happen. Question?
You have a question in chat.
Okay. Oh yeah, I see it. I see it. Did I just press it here?
We could continue to you if that's so.
Yeah, if you can read it, I just don't want to mess it up.
What do the Hebrew translations of the number of days, example, does 7 have some relevance?
Yeah. I mean, I think the relevance is the Hebrew translation of the 7 days is that idea that a temple is being created. God is creating the universe in 7 days. And it's telling us that the universe is his temple, not a building, right? At the beginning, the universe was his temple and he came here. And it's interesting when we see it, what did he put in the middle of the garden? So if the garden is, God's temple, then what's in the middle of the garden? Knowledge of good and evil. And what else did he put in the garden? 2 people, right? Right. So like in the ancient world, what would have gone in a temple? Something that would sometimes be called an image or an idol, right? So like when you build a temple in the ancient world, you put an image or an idol in the middle of it that represented that God. Well, here again, 7 days is telling us that like God's building a temple. And in the middle of that temple, the garden, he puts his image, but his image isn't an idol. His image is people. Like we're the ones that show the world what this God is like, which is a big responsibility, right? But that's showing you again that this is an idea of like, this is a temple. And in the middle of that temple, there isn't a golden image of the God of the moon or the God of the sun. No, the image that is put in the middle of this temple is us, is the humans. And we bear his image. We show the world. And that's, that's kind of where it gets separated now. We're not always a very good representation of that image in the world sometimes. And so the story is God is continually trying to overlap this so we can connect again, right? And so on the right there, the temple is one of God's attempts to do this, right? So like he creates the temple as a space where people can come, people can meet him. There's the Holy of Holies. There's all this ritual and things that happen that allow people to try to connect back to God. And so that's one attempt, all the stories of him meeting and connecting with Abraham, with Isaac, with all the people in the Bible are attempts at God trying to connect back to his people and create this space that gets a little more overlapped more and more again, right? To where he can connect to his people again. Again, this is kind of like where we are now or where we are. I didn't draw this. This came from the Bible Project. If you're interested, they have a lot of great resources. But, this is where Jesus gets in trouble, right? So God made the temple, and that's where the people went to connect to God. And then Jesus shows up and he says, yeah, let me take this connection point to God outside the temple. So he starts going into the community and into people that are labeled as sinners, as people that you shouldn't be around. And he starts taking the connection point to God outside of that temple space. And people start to say, well, that can't be, right? And so Jesus expands it even further and is trying to make this overlap even more. So we've got the garden as a temple. We've got the temple as a temple. Then if you look in the New Testament, Jesus is called what? Temple, right? He says, if you tear this temple down in 3 days, I'll rebuild it, right? So he speaks of himself as a temple. And then if we get to Paul, who then becomes the temple of God at that point? We do, right? So like now we're the temple of God as a body of believers. We're seen as God's temple. So you can see this story of like, again, it was together, got separated, and then God is continuously trying to bring this back together. And the beautiful thing is that through Jesus, he uses us to do so. So now we're the ones that can go out into the world and we can make a little spot of connection point to God. We can bring his love, his mercy, his justice, all the things that we know of God, we can bring it into the world around us and create spaces where God can then connect again to his people, which is basically what he's been doing since the very first page of Genesis. And when we get to the last page, it's complete, right? that's pretty much it.
Wow, that was great.
Thanks.
Thank you. One quick question,
Sure.
if you're able to
Yeah.
address Adam and Eve as historical figures.
Yeah.
The-
So, I mean, again, I think that sometimes I don't have a great answer for that for people, depending on what they want. Like, again, I think the thing that's important is there's a point where God, whether they existed as the historical person at that time, you start getting into like, well, how is the earth and all this kind of stuff, right? So the reality is that there was a world that was together that they were a part of that got broken. And that's the part I key in on, is like the part to take away, I think, is kind of maybe again, it's the functional side instead of the materialistic side of like saying, okay, did they exist? And if so, when and how long ago was it? Like, you get caught in all that. Well, the thing to take away is that God wants to connect to us, and we get in the way of that connection sometimes through our own sin, through our own failures, through our own things. And Adam and Eve are certainly show us how that started, right? And it shows us that like our idea of thinking we can be like God by figuring out what's good and what's bad isn't the way to God, So like I look at it as sure, like I don't know all the details of it. It kind of goes to the materialistic side of like, I'm not saying that God didn't materially create the world, because he did. It's just that Genesis isn't really the story of that. It's telling us how it functions, and then what do we make of that from there. So I make of Adam and Eve like my own ability to be deceived by thinking that the way for me to get to God is through figuring out the knowledge of good and evil. Right? Like that's the trap that's always there for us. And that's what they teach us so well. So I got an answer. I mean, a question. I got to see a hand raised online.
Hi, I'm Emily Summers. I'm calling from Virginia.
Read it.
And
That's the question you already answered.
Yeah, you already
Oh.
answered it. You've been there.
It looks like Emily's trying to speak.
Yeah, she had her hand raised.
She's trying to speak, Emily? Were you gonna?
yes,
We can't
Can you
hear
hear
you.
me?
Maybe you could just type in the chat.
okay.
I think she's typing, but I'm not.
Yes.
While she's typing, Jenny has an announcement. So if you want to go ahead, and we might be able to come back to the question.
Let's see, I have 3 jobs this month in the congregation, and I'm trying to tell you about all of them. Next week is Pi Day, and I know Nelson knows what Pi Day is, but I'm assuming most of the rest of you do too. So the fellowship committee is going to have Pi Day celebration next Sunday. If you want to bring a pie, that's fine. Otherwise, we're going to have savory pies in the form of services will be downstairs. Next announcement is I am now the chair or the captain of the crop walk, or the congregation team at the crop walk. That comes on the 29th of this month. It starts in front of Duke Chapel. The festivities supposedly start at 1:30. The walk starts at 2:30. Usually we walk from the chapel all the way to East Campus and back. Many people don't make it all the way, but if you want to, but it's a nice thing. They usually have the Durham Children's Choir. They have a band, cheerleaders. It's a good thing to come to. Lastly, as part of the education committee, we are going to have a retreat in the month of April, on April 18th. Church, it'll be it's a morning only retreat, or it's a morning and to lunch retreat, and more about that become available. Just to put on your calendar for now.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Andy. We have some discussions going. A potential future topic would be looking at the German church at the rise of Hitler and their response. That's something that has a World War II history buff and theologian that we are considering for the future. But next week we have Bill DeFulvio, a success coach and partnership coordinator at Step Up Durham, who will lead us on participating in God's shalom through restorative justice and proximity, how our lives are part of healing broken systems. So, all right, thank you so much. Thank you, Andy. Thank you for attending, and we'll see you next week.